Hi, everybody. For something a little bit different, this talk is a little bit meta about API design and how you can design an API that reflects the current state of your product and what you need it to do while still bringing a developer community along with you. So a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking about today is more of a history lesson, or if for some of you might know some of these details already, more than a list of advice or anything in particular that I've done. It's more about things that we can learn that other companies have done that may be informative as you're thinking about building an API program yourselves. So, who am I? Hi, my name's Bear. I lead the developer relations team over at Slack. Before that, I spent some time at Twitter. Before that, I was at Facebook. So I've been at companies that have large groups of developers that they're trying to educate. We've taken it beyond having, say, 2,000 people who are really excited and passionate about your product. And when you're trying to bring it out to millions and millions of people, you get a certain change in the developer community that you're working with. It's not the people who are necessarily psyched that they're there to be using your product. It's every developer who might be curious and might be coming from different backgrounds. So they have certain different expectations about what you're going to be teaching them and what they might know already. So you may be wondering, what exactly is developer relations anyway? And if you were here earlier for Mary Thengvall's talk, you might know from her a little bit about what it is that we do. But for the purposes of this talk, I want to make sure you know a few things about what it is that developer relations does. First, one of the biggest parts of our job is to teach people how to use APIs. Usually an API, we're usually here representing a company, but sometimes there are developer relations people who work on web standards or just on open source in general. So we teach people to use some set of APIs. And in that process, we use a lot of APIs ourselves, whether it's just for writing sample code or just looking at what other people are doing in the field so that we know where the general state of the web is going. That takes a bunch of our time. And over the course of doing all of that work, we tend to develop pretty strong opinions about what constitutes a good API, an intuitive API. And it's part of our job to share that back with our product and engineering teams who are very busy building the thing, and so they might not be spending as much time doing the market research. So as part of our job, we spend a lot of time talking to engineers about the APIs that we represent or that we work with, and you can see what sticks and what doesn't conceptually when you're trying to teach people a new technology. And when I'm talking about new, I'm thinking more broadly about like really big shifts, not just here's a new RESTful service. So we're talking about designing APIs that make sense because you want people to use them. Ideally, you can get people to just use your API because it's got some compelling value proposition. It does more than just solve a pain point for people. They're really interested in it for its own sake. But the more that you can do to just lower the barrier to people understanding how to use it, the easier it will be for them to adopt. So talking at the level of different types of technology, there's a great post by the team over at README about the history of how REST came to be. And this was around 2000, and the state of the world was that people who were using APIs were using old protocols like SOAP, and they had some problems with them. They were complex, they were really hard to test, there were some inconsistencies in how they were implemented across different API services, and what Roy Fielding in his dissertation wanted to bring to the web was some amount of consistency here. The web was designed with a client-server model, and so this new protocol should follow that. They wanted a uniform interface for consistency, for testability. REST APIs should have been stateless, and also they wanted cacheability for this new system of the web that was being developed. So in his dissertation, this is the TLDR. I wasn't cherry picking anything that is complex to read, but if we read it out, the name representational state transfer is intended to evoke an image of how a well-designed web application behaves. It's a network of web pages, which compose a virtual state machine, where the user progresses through the application by selecting links, state transitions, resulting in the next page, representing the next state of the application, being transferred to the user and rendered for their use. Now, this is a very accurate and succinct sum up of what REST is, but how many of you found this possible to parse with ease? Right, so it was a big thing, it was a transformative thing, and it was totally a good design for the web that was emerging. But this isn't really that easy to wrap your head around. So slowly over time, we saw a few companies adopting this new protocol. One of the first was Salesforce, but they did it in a closed program. The next company to really adopt REST was eBay. And so if you hop into the Wayback Machine and look at eBay's developer portal from the beginning, the end of 2000, they've got some information on their API kit and what's included there. And one of the things that this page does is it talks about what you can get from this RESTful API. What is get item, and what happens when you reach out to eBay's servers and say, get me this item? And so what this did was a few things. First of all, it made this abstraction that is REST, that was that computer scientist parsable but not generally accessible description of what representational state transfer is, much more concrete. You might not understand that paragraph, but you can easily understand what it means to get item information from eBay. So it took that and made it more concrete. The next thing that they did was really critical, was that they provided sample code. And they gave people examples that they could build off of to make doing all of this easier. They showed you what you could expect back, kind of like Postman does today. It's very standard these days, but back then that was revolutionary to say, what can you actually expect from our API? And they gave people an incentive to learn. And that incentive was, if you could use eBay's API, there was money to be made. And I don't want to undersell that point there. Because eBay was one of the first people to adopt this, and because they enabled this third-party ecosystem of people who could buy and sell on eBay through their API, it was a big incentive for people to be like, all right, I have to get my head around this REST thing. And so this, oh no, I can't backtrack. But that messy paragraph turned into something that was much, much easier. So fast forward a few more years and take a look at Flickr's API. By this time, people are understanding a little bit more what this REST thing is about. It's 6 years later. There are a few more APIs doing this. And one of the things that Flickr did was take this into a consumer sphere. It wasn't all about businesses buying and selling items on eBay. This was something where people were uploading their own content and then maybe making it programmatically available to other people. And in all of this, they are explaining some of the basics here. If you read this, would you ever expect that these days an API provider of a REST API would tell you, by the way, you need to send us an API key? What is that? Every time you come and send a request to us, you have to send us a parameter format to specify a response format. This is a different level of education that they had to do in 2006 compared to what we have to do today to teach people the same thing. The next thing that was interesting about Flickr, which we'll talk about a little bit later, was the notion of authentication. People on Flickr put up their own content, and Flickr didn't own that content. The users who uploaded the photos did. So if you were an application that wanted to use people's photos from Flickr, you had to have a means to get their permission to do that. And that was another big step that we're going to be talking about in a second. And what Flickr realized was that that part was actually a really substantial hurdle. And so they offered these things, API kits, that were available in a bunch of languages, Cold Fusion, anyone? That would help people get access to all this stuff while getting to leapfrog over the things that were hairy and complicated and unfun. And it's because the incentive set was a little bit different. People were talking about Web 2.0 being a thing. You could build a bunch of businesses if you wanted, but the value prop wasn't necessarily as clear. eBay was straightforward, like buy and sell, money is right there. Getting people's photos is one more step removed, so giving people this extra help with the developer tooling to reduce the complexity really helped the Flickr API get adopted. So fast forward now to 2010, and let's talk about something else that had required a really big design shift, and that's Facebook. So when people started really adopting Facebook, after they opened it up to everybody and not just college students, the thing that you can see even in the way that they've represented the logo is that they needed to shift how objects related to each other in a way that didn't really sit well with the REST model. People on Facebook were connected to other people, but they were also connected to pages they liked. And that connection of page I like, that relationship, was a different edge connection than it was between two people who might be friends. And so having there be differences between connection types as well as the content of nodes made it obvious that what they wanted to use was a graph. And at the time, there weren't really graphs being used in the same distribution. It wasn't as popular. But you can see that there are certain things that you might want to fetch from Facebook that break down if you try and service them through a REST API. Suppose you want to find out a list of all of the movies that my friends like. If you try and do that in a set of calls where you go first fetch a list of friends and then iterate through it and then get all of their movies and then you have to go through and dedupe, it's not really designed to work in a way that's efficient. And so Facebook had to make the decision, all right, we're just going to break this and we're going to try something new and we're going to call it a graph API. And so what they did was they decided, you know, we're going to go one better and just move to calling it a standard. And they built the open graph. And the idea behind it was that if you got people to understand, one, what a graph was, and two, got them to contribute to it, you would all of a sudden have a very, very rich data set about people, the things they interacted with, and how they interacted with them, because those different edge types could be qualitatively different. It's different if I have watched a movie versus I express that it is my favorite movie or I like it. And so they had this grand vision that if we can get developers to contribute, you get this really rich data set. And here we get into, again, a slightly confusing educational moment where it says the Open Graph Protocol enables any web page to become a rich object in a social graph. What does that mean? For instance, this is used on Facebook to allow any web page to have the same functionality as any other object on Facebook. And again, I'm not cherry picking. This is like the TLDR that's still on the Open Graph page. It's a little more meaningful in retrospect because you might have seen objects that exist on Facebook as rich objects, meaning they're displayed not just as a single image or as a piece of text, but maybe you can play a video clip or something like that. And so when we were trying to teach developers what on earth it meant to participate in this API, we had to get them all up in the idea of the graph. We talked about hacking the graph, and we tried to create this educational flow in the setup where you create an Open Graph app where we said first, all right, you're going to have to define your action types. And we had to teach people what does it mean to have a different action type, like you're running a race or you're watching a movie or you're listening to a song. And then after that, people had to define the different types of object that they were going to put into the graph. And we thought, well, you know, people might be relatively familiar with object-oriented programming. It's not that much of a leap to define your action type and your object type. But it turns out it really was. We got a lot of meaningless gobbledygook, like people would insert brand names. So you might Zorg a mix on like a SoundCloud type app. And people really didn't know what that meant. And a lot of people also got stuck on this step because they were like, what does this even mean? How do I think about the graph? And so we had a really hard educational moment bringing the community along with us. And so we kept on with this education, like you have to stick in with the graph, and made it a little bit difficult too by basing all of this on the fact that every object in the graph had to be attached to a live and public web page. At the time, no longer true, but this was definitely true in 2012. And so this made people really, it was a sticking point. It didn't work right off the bat. People had to think, okay, well, what does it mean for my website to be an object in a graph? How do I represent it? But the things that really stuck were the easy meta properties, the open graph tags that you could just stick on a web page and find that it rendered in Facebook. And that was the part that really helped people get over the mental hurdle. It's like, okay, if I just give my web page some information about this is a newspaper article and it's got this title and it's got this image that should display on Facebook, all of a sudden that was the thing that really landed. The connection between what they saw on Facebook and these easy meta tags gave people that bridge to start thinking about graph data. So in the end, that open graph, like define whatever you want, define whatever action type you want, slowly faded away because there were only a few categories where we saw people were really getting good, meaningful information out of it. It was about books, articles, media you consumed, and people's profiles. So media and profiles ended up what it was being. But I do believe that it paved the way for GraphQL to be as successful as it is today, because it took that connection between how you think about data about people and the many things that they're related to, and why this makes more sense in a graph. But it was a major uphill battle, and it took us a long time. So now this is something that is maybe a little bit more parsable, where you can see that you're chaining a bunch of requests, where you start off with albums, Then you want to fetch a certain number of photos from that albums, and then you also want to get the name of people who are tagged in it. But this would have been completely inscrutable like 10 years ago because people weren't really acclimated to the idea that that's what that was. So that's another example of a time we brought a community along, but it took a long time and it was super painful. Let's go back to the Flickr example because I punted on the auth question, but that's another thing that's important to talk about. Flickr services, you had to have some authorization from the user who owned the photos to take them through the API. And that's really painful to do. And so around, I think OAuth started in like 2008, 2009, a bunch of different services realized that we needed a better way for somebody who is a resource owner, say it's of photos or say it's of your Facebook profile data, to grant authorization to a third party that was not the same service as where you were hosting all this information, to that information without sharing your credentials. And this is deep nerd territory. How many of you use an API that uses OAuth? How many of you have read the OAuth spec? I'm sorry. So one of the reasons that it's really good that a lot of you have not had to read it is because it's hairy and it's messy. The general principle is pretty straightforward. You want to be able to get permission to these resources without having to literally share credentials, and you want some safety features, like you want to be able to revoke this access at any given time, and you want to restrict scope on what it is that somebody can access. You don't want to give them full credential access to your account. But the actual implementation is pretty hairy. And really what you want people to get is just this high-level idea that there is an application that should be able to access your account within some limited scope, and people should feel safe saying, okay. And over time, the way that OAuth has been implemented that most of us are probably familiar with is with that resource owner being a single user. And that makes sense for a lot of consumer services like Twitter or like Facebook. I own the photos that I put up on Flickr. I own my profile information on Facebook, and I own my tweets. But in the case of Slack, we ran into an issue where people wanted to use apps inside organizations, but it was really, really painful that, for example, if everybody inside your organization is using Google Drive to host files, and your whole company buys access to Google Drive or to Box or to Dropbox as a company, every single user would have to authorize and say, I signed in on my account here, and I can't see docs that people were sharing in Slack until I gave my personal user token access. So we thought, okay, well, why don't we just change who the resource grantor is so that instead of being the individual user, it's the workspace. It's like the whole company, and that way you can just log on and roll in. Your IT admin sets up that you should have access to Box, or your design team has access to Figma, and everyone just is ready to go. And so we started a project where we tried changing that and redesigning the OAuth flow. And it flopped. People were not that interested in doing it. They were not really getting out of the model of the auth flow being different, the resource grantor being different. And there are a couple of reasons. One, we started off with being on OAuth in the first place, and people were generally familiar with that. But when we tried to make this change, it relied on people really understanding our data model in a way that people shouldn't have to. We had to think a lot about platform-specific concepts like, what is a workspace? What is an org? What's a channel? How are they different? How does being a member of a channel restrict or change the access you should be able to give to different parts of your organization? It's too much, and it didn't have enough payoff. We supported with tooling and rewrote our documentation to make it as easy of a path as possible for people to upgrade, but they just didn't want to because the payoff wasn't there. And so we scrapped the project, and we're working on making this better so that people can still use the concepts that they're familiar with OAuth, but without having to totally rewrite their apps because we were trying to solve this one pretty tightly scoped problem. So the context here, the overall conclusion here is that context matters when you're trying to teach developers something brand new versus learning what they know. In the case of REST, people were really hitting problems with SOAP. They wanted something new for the web. They had incentives because the first few APIs were eBay, were Amazon. There was money to be made. In the case of Facebook's Open Graph, just the possibility of what you could do with 1 billion people's data and what businesses you could build on that was compelling enough that people were able to stick with it. When they hit the hurdle of like, what is this graph thing? It didn't matter because persisting had a payoff. So when you're thinking about whether or not you're going to bust from convention and try and write a quirky API versus sticking to what people know, think about who your developers are. What do they already know? That first 1,000 people that you talk to are going to be very different from the first 100,000 or the first million. When might they give up? Where are things going to get hard? And what is their incentive to keep on trying? And if you can't answer those questions about what's going to keep them trying, then it's really important to make sure that they have as few hurdles as possible. So I've talked a very long time, and I think we might not have time for questions, but I will be sticking around. Do we have time for a question?
Yes.
Yeah, oh, wait, time for a question.
Maybe two.
Maybe even two. Yeah.
So it's a little bit off topic, but this is something I want to ask somebody from Slack.
Okay.
And it's a concern as well. Are you by any chance introducing scene or last scene in Slack?
I can't talk to roadmap questions on stage being live streamed. I'm sorry.
Cool.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I could have probably asked you this offline, but since you mentioned you had to rewrite the documentation, did you have to change the persona that you had in mind? Or rewriting, was it like changing the whole approach or the content, or was it focusing a different group of people?
It's a really good question. So because this was going to be such a fundamental shift, we had two distinct audiences. The people who were going to be brand new to the platform as of after this shift, and the people who are going to have to migrate their apps and think about translating things to the new model of working. So we did rewrite primarily with the existing user in mind, mostly because we knew that we had a lot of people who were very deep in the platform already. But we had bifurcated docs, essentially, that said at the top of a page you could go and it would say, if you're new here, go to this page, and if you're looking to migrate, read all of this. So we didn't think that it fundamentally changed our audience except for that factor, but we did account for it. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay, great.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.